Chapter 1. The Bloom Before the Fall. The scent of lilies clung to Sophie Lane's skin like a secret. Sharp and sweet, like the edge of memory, it lingered in the folds of her linen shirt and in the soft creases beneath her eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent arranging funeral wreaths she couldn't afford to deliver. Outside, the August sun beat down on Brooklyn's Montague Street, unrelenting. Inside her family's struggling flower shop, it was cooler, quieter, save for the buzz of a flickering fluorescent bulb and the low hum of dread curling in Sophie's stomach. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the open ledger. 143, 280, 94. She stared at the number as if repetition might make it gentler. It didn't. It was a monster, cruel in its precision. A culmination of unpaid taxes, overdue loans, and the spiraling medical bills her father had hidden behind charming winks and too easy jokes until his stroke left him half paralyzed and their world teetering. Sophie sank onto the stool behind the counter, her fingertips dusted with pollen. The warmth of the shop, once her sanctuary, now felt like a slow suffocation. She had already sold her violin. That thought came unbidden, unwelcome, like a ghost pressing cold fingers against her neck. 3 years ago, in a moment of stubborn pride and desperation, she'd pawned the 19th-century Vuillaume her mother once called an extension of Sophie's soul. She hadn't touched music since. Not since the competition scandal. Not since she ran from the conservatory. Now she arranged roses for half the price they were worth and prayed the credit card machine wouldn't decline again. The bell above the door chimed. Sophie straightened with a forced smile, expecting another florist delivery or an annoyed customer. But in swept Margot Delacourt a vision in oversized sunglasses and wealth that smelled of oud and judgment. Her platinum hair was tied in a scarf the color of expensive sin, and she wore heels sharp enough to puncture pride. Margot removed her glasses and assessed the shop with a practiced sigh. Still charmingly tragic. "Good morning to you too," Sophie said dryly, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you to the land of the wilting?" Margot ignored the jab. "You're in trouble." Sophie arched a brow. "That's not news." "No. But I bring a solution, which, given your charming tragedy, you're in no position to decline." Margot. "A charity auction." "Absolutely not. It's for the Whitmore Foundation. All proceeds go to arts programs in underserved communities, your old stomping grounds. You'll be escorted by the highest bidder to a gala. 1 evening, 1 date. No expectations." Sophie snorted. "You make it sound so noble." Margot didn't flinch. "It's the kind of event where your name, your face could circulate. Connections. Patrons. Opportunity. Sophie. You remember that, don't you? The thing you used to chase before you buried yourself in tulips and self-pity." The words hit their mark. Sophie swallowed against the heat rising in her chest. "You'd look exquisite in green," Margot added, more softly now. "That silk dress of your mother's is still in the upstairs closet, isn't it? I haven't worn that since her funeral. Then it's time it meant something else." Silence pressed between them, taut and uncomfortable. "Who even attends these auctions?" Sophie muttered. Margot's lips curled. "The usual devils. CEOs. Deck royalty. Hedge fund jackals. And perhaps—" she paused for effect. "Julian Cross." Sophie blinked. "The Julian Cross? The very same. He's sponsoring the gala. Reclusive, brooding, and still drowning in guilt over his late fiancée. Wouldn't say boo to a ghost. But he writes $1,000,000 checks like postcards. You'd like him." Sophie rolled her eyes. "I doubt he'd like me. That's not the point. All you need is 1 evening. 1 winning bid." She stared again at the ledger. At her father's carefully scrawled debts. At the dream of paying off the shop and walking into the hospital not as a beggar but a daughter who could finally fix something. Her hands curled into fists. "I'll think about it." That night, Sophie stood in front of the antique mirror in her bedroom. The green silk dress whispering against her skin like a question she wasn't ready to answer. It fit tighter than she remembered, but it still hugged her like memory fluid, familiar, too intimate. Her mother had worn it to galas where wine flowed like water and music drifted through marble halls. Now it would be worn to sell Sophie to the highest bidder. The irony wasn't lost on her. She applied her makeup slowly, deliberately, a soft sweep of rose across her cheeks, a flick of eyeliner, a coat of mascara thick enough to disguise the fatigue beneath her eyes. Her hair, once always pulled back in a musician's knot, now fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Feminine. Elegant. Untouchable. When she emerged downstairs, Margot whistled low. "You look like heartbreak dressed in emerald," she said. Sophie's lips quirked. "Hopefully heartbreak pays well." The ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel sparkled like something out of Gatsby's Resurrection. Crystal chandeliers dangled like frozen tears, and violins floated through the air like perfume. Sophie stepped inside and felt the crush of wealth close in on her, the sharp scent of cologne, the glint of diamonds, the tension of 1,000 gazes trained to assess worth within seconds. She didn't belong here. Not anymore. "Remember," Margot whispered at her side, "this is performance. Don't think about the money. Think about possibility." But all Sophie could think about was the way eyes followed her, hungry, curious, transactional. She felt like a painting in a silent auction, frame and all. The stage was small, ringed with golden uplights. A velvet curtain parted, and the host, a flamboyant auctioneer with a silver bow tie and Hollywood grin, welcomed the crowd with the gusto of a game show MC. The bachelorettes before her glided across the stage like swans, poised and plastic. Sophie sipped her champagne and waited her turn, the bubbles fizzing against her anxiety. Then, finally, "And now, we welcome our next guest, Miss Sophie Lane." Applause. Whistles. A few murmured exclamations of, "Who?" Sophie stepped into the spotlight, and the world slowed. She felt her mother's perfume on her skin, heard the tremor of her father's voice, saw her own reflection in every pair of assessing eyes. She walked with grace, chin high, fingers curled delicately at her sides. She stood center stage and exhaled. The bidding began. 10,000. 15. 20. It was fast, at first playful banter between suited men, eager to show off. A Wall Street executive in a navy Tom Ford suit winked at her. She looked away. A young hotel heir raised a glass of scotch and smirked. Her stomach turned. 35,000. 40. The crowd murmured, sensing a rising tension. 55. A pause. The auctioneer grinned. Going once. 250,000. The room gasped. All heads turned toward the back, where a man in a charcoal three-piece suit stood, half hidden in shadow. He didn't raise his paddle. He didn't speak again. He simply looked at Sophie. And in that moment, the glittering room receded into silence. His gaze was unreadable, cool, almost bored, but beneath it pulsed something darker. Grief? Hunger? She couldn't tell. But her breath caught. The auctioneer recovered. 250, a generous offer indeed. Going once, twice, sold. Applause scattered through the room like confetti. Sophie descended the stage slowly, the hem of her dress trailing behind her like a question mark. Margot intercepted her before she reached the bidder. "You're not going to faint, are you?" she whispered. "I might," Sophie said. "You're about to meet Julian Cross." Sophie blinked. "What?" But there he was, taller than she expected, with hair just unruly enough to defy perfection, and a jawline carved from stone. His eyes were a wintry gray blue, the color of Manhattan just before snowfall. He extended a hand without smiling. "Miss Lane." His voice was velvet and iron, controlled, dangerous. Sophie hesitated, then took his hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm, but there was no affection in the gesture. It was a transaction. "Mr. Cross." Their handshake lingered just a breath too long. He released her. "We'll speak soon. You'll receive terms in the morning." And just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like mist. Sophie stood frozen in the afterglow of the most expensive minute of her life. She had been bought, but something in her heart whispered, "You are not the only one with something to lose." Chapter 2. The Man in the Shadows. Julian Cross hated evenings like this. He stood alone near the back of the ballroom, half shrouded in the shadow of a towering palm centerpiece, his gaze scanning the room as if studying a battlefield. His name might have graced the donor wall and the foundation banner, but he wore the discomfort of this spectacle like a stone around his neck. He didn't belong to this world anymore, not really. Not since Elise. Around him, champagne sparkled in flutes, and laughter rose in polished crescendos. Women in sapphire gowns flirted with senators. Billionaires smirked over cigars, buying nights and fantasies like they were stocks to be flipped. The gleaming spectacle of high society at its most efficient, sentimental, shallow, and utterly transactional. He turned away from the glittering herd and reached for his drink. Scotch. Neat. Unapologetically bitter. Julian, came a silk-wrapped voice to his right. I'm impressed you actually showed. He didn't need to turn to know it was Veronica. Don't sound so shocked, he said without inflection. Veronica Dale, his cousin by blood and saboteur by instinct, slipped up beside him like perfume intoxicating and artificial. Her black velvet dress clung like a secret. Her wine-dark lips curved in a smile that knew too much. I thought you'd skip it again. Not exactly your scene these days, she purred. He gave a slow blink. And yet, here I am. Pretending. You do that so well. She sipped her champagne. Tell me, is the ice sculpture extravagant enough for your liking? Julian's eyes followed the glittering monstrosity across the room, a swan of diamond-shaped ice-bleeding droplets onto a silver tray. A grotesque metaphor, if he ever saw one. I donated $6 million. I'd prefer not to fund poultry, he said. Veronica laughed. Oh, Jules. You haven't changed. No, he said, low. You just keep hoping I will. She tilted her head. You should make an effort. The board's been asking questions again. You've been distant. I've been managing a multi-billion-dollar investment portfolio. That's not distant. That's productive. And yet, not a single interview in 8 months. No galas. No editorials. No charity dinners. Her eyes narrowed. The Julian Cross brand is starting to look a little brittle. His jaw flexed. Is that what I am to you now? A brand? Veronica set her glass down. Don't be dramatic. You're an asset. But assets have to stay polished. Julian didn't reply. Instead, he watched the stage as the host continued his elaborate presentation of the next eligible bachelorette, a nauseating term, but the crowd adored it. The next woman was introduced, and Julian prepared to look away until he saw her. Emerald green. It wasn't just the color of her dress. It was the way it caught the light, like forest caught in a storm. The way it made her skin glow like soft candlelight, and her eyes. God. Those eyes cut through the room like arrows made of wildfire and silk. Sophie Lane. The name echoed through the room, and Julian straightened. She didn't glide like the others had. She walked with a stillness that defied the stage, a kind of earned poise, like someone who had nothing left to perform for. Her gaze was steady, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides, nervous, restrained, vulnerable. Julian's chest tightened, unbidden. He had seen thousands of women in this city, models, actresses, investors' daughters, women trained to seduce the spotlight. But Sophie? She looked like she wanted to run from it, and that's what made her magnetic. Then the bidding began. Julian didn't move. 20,000. 30. 45. He watched a man in a monogrammed suit flash his watch like a prize. Another bidder licked his lips while laughing with his table. A third leaned in and whispered something crude behind a smirk. Julian's pulse quickened not with jealousy, with fury. They didn't see her. They saw a number, a transaction, a fantasy to be bought and discarded like overpriced cufflinks. Something cold and ancient woke up inside him. He raised his hand. 250,000. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the host blinked, voice faltering before repeating the number. Julian didn't care about the money. He had paid more for a Rothko painting he never even liked. But this wasn't about charity or spectacle. This was control. A brief flicker of her expression reached him as she locked eyes with him for the first time. She didn't smile, didn't blush. She just looked. And Julian, for the first time in years, felt seen Julian remained still as the crowd dispersed around him, conversations slowly regaining their rhythm like a machine jolted back into motion. But his attention stayed locked on Sophie Lane as she stepped off the stage. She looked composed, but not polished, at least not in the way these women were trained to be. There was something raw in the way her eyes moved, like she was absorbing every detail for survival. He admired that. It was the look of someone used to holding themselves together in the dark. She was walking toward him now. Margot Delacourt, the infamous socialite fixer, guided her like a handler with a prizefighter. When Margot's voice reached him wry and full of approval, he forced himself to shift out of his reverie. "Sophie, allow me to introduce your generous benefactor. Mr. Julian Cross." Sophie's gaze met his again. This time, closer. Up close, she was even more startling. Not in a way he could easily name, not beauty in the cinematic sense. Her face was too expressive, her freckles too real. But there was something wild beneath the poise. Something uncurated. Her collarbone lifted with each breath, barely contained by the low neckline of her mother's dress. Julian extended his hand with the precision of someone who hated touch but knew when it was required. "Miss Lane." She took it, her grip firmer than expected. "Mr. Cross." Her voice was smooth but not demure, cool silk drawn over a blade. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her pulse flicked just beneath the curve of her neck. Still, she held his gaze. Didn't flinch. Didn't flirt. Didn't pretend. That unsettled him more than any simpering heiress ever had. "I appreciate the bid," she said evenly, after a beat. Julian tilted his head slightly. "You'll receive a contract in the morning." Her brow arched. "A contract?" He nodded once. "For the duration of the month. I assume you're aware this was not a one-night arrangement." Sophie blinked. Margot jumped in. "It's standard for the larger donations," she said quickly. "The higher-tier bidders arrange for their dates to accompany them to philanthropic events throughout the month. It boosts PR and donor retention. Purely professional, of course." Julian's mouth twitched just slightly. "Professional is the word." Sophie turned her gaze back to him. "And if I don't like the terms?" Julian regarded her with cool interest. "Then you don't sign. And the money? It's a donation. No refund clause. I don't play petty." Something flickered in her expression, half surprise, half something softer. "So you're buying time, not favors." Julian's voice dropped, quieter now, only for her. "I don't need to buy favors, Miss Lane." The air between them changed sharp, charged. Sophie was the one who broke it, stepping back with a polite nod. "Then I'll wait for the contract." Julian gave a curt nod and turned away, retreating into the shadows where he belonged. But as he walked, he realized his heart was beating faster than it had in months. Years, even. What was that, he thought? That stare. That steadiness. That refusal to shrink beneath the weight of money or myth. Veronica was waiting near the back of the ballroom, drink in hand and expression unreadable. "So that's your taste now?" she murmured as he approached. "Florists in vintage dresses?" Julian didn't answer. She stepped closer, voice honeyed and sharp. "Careful, darling. Strays can be dangerous, especially the ones who look like they have something to prove." Julian's jaw ticked. "You should worry less about my distractions and more about your own." Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I always worry about what's mine." He walked past her, the weight of her gaze trailing like poison down his spine. In the back of the hotel, in a quiet hallway lined with framed portraits of donors past, Julian paused beside a mirror. He rarely looked at himself, not anymore. But tonight, he did. He looked tired. Sharp suit, glassy eyes, hair neatly combed and somehow still wild around the edges. The same face the tabloids used to worship. The same eyes Elise used to trace with her fingers. The same mouth that hadn't spoken her name in over 2 years. And yet tonight, he'd said Sophie. Not in passing. Not in protocol. He'd said her name like a tether. A test. And it had meant something. He stepped back from the mirror. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be simple. Chapter 3. A Contract of Strangers. Sophie Lane sat at the small round table in her flower shop's back room. her fingers trailing over the pristine edges of the contract. 8 ivory pages. Thick stock. Weighted ink. The kind of document that carried consequences just by existing. Employment agreement. Sophie Lane and Julian Cross. Effective term. 30 days. Purpose. Personal appearance and philanthropic representation. It read like a business acquisition. But the language was clear, careful, even respectful. No mention of intimacy. No insinuations of ownership. A list of events, bullet-pointed, with dates and locations, galas, charity auctions, a fundraiser at the Met, a silent art auction in Soho, one weekend in Cape Cod. All optional, but participation strongly preferred. Sophie folded her hands in her lap, ignoring the tea growing cold beside her. She wasn't sure if she felt like a guest star in someone else's movie, or a very expensive employee. A knock at the back door startled her. She rose, brushing her skirt, and opened it to reveal a sharply dressed woman holding an envelope and a leather-bound planner. "Miss Lane?" the woman asked crisply. "Julian Cross's office. I'm here to escort you to the signing." Sophie blinked. "Escort me?" The woman's smile was flat. "Mr. Cross prefer punctuality." Sophie wanted to protest, to say she had a business to run. But the truth was, she'd already prepared a replacement schedule for the week. Margot had insisted. So now, with her apron traded for a cream silk blouse and her nerves crammed into designer heels, she nodded and followed the woman into a sleek black town car waiting at the curb. Julian's office was a penthouse fortress of glass and steel high above Midtown, the kind of place that swallowed sky and turned silence into dominance. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan sprawling in all directions, hazy and sunlit, a kingdom under surveillance. Sophie was led through a long hallway lined with abstract art, violent slashes of red and black, raw and strange, before arriving in the heart of the suite. A minimalist office, all sharp angles and immaculate surfaces. Julian stood behind a low-slung desk, dressed in a graphite gray shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms like sculpted restraint. He didn't look up at first, signing something with the precision of a man who hated waste. Only when she cleared her throat did he speak. "You're early. You sound disappointed." That got a flicker of amusement across his face. It vanished quickly. "Please," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from him. She sat, crossing her legs, holding his gaze as if to say, "I'm not afraid of you." He handed her a pen and the final version of the contract. "You'll be compensated weekly. Discretion is expected. You may decline any event with 24 hours' notice." Her lips twitched. "Is there a safe word?" Julian's eyes snapped up. For a split second, he looked caught off guard. "I'm joking," she said. "Mostly." He said nothing for a moment. Then, slowly, his mouth curved barely, but it was the first honest expression she'd seen on him since the auction. "I had a feeling you might be difficult. Only with men who write checks larger than my student loans." That pulled a quiet exhale from him, half laugh, half sigh. "I'm not interested in owning anyone, Miss Lane." "No," she said softly. "You're interested in control." Not quite the same thing. They looked at each other for a beat too long. Then she signed. With a single flourish, Sophie Lane agreed to become the companion of one of the most powerful men in New York for 30 days. And not once did she feel owned. Only observed. Watched. Understood, perhaps too well. Later that afternoon, they sat together in the back of a town car heading toward the first event, a rooftop gallery opening in Tribeca. Julian sat rigid, silent, like a man conserving every word as if it were currency. Sophie finally broke the quiet. "So, why me?" He glanced over. "You're not like the others," he said. She snorted. "What others?" "The ones who came expecting a crown, or a ring, or a headline. You looked like you were trying not to cry." She stilled. He looked out the window. "That's not a criticism." "No," she said after a pause. "Just an observation." Outside, the city blurred past, golden with the lowering sun. Inside the car, silence returned, but it wasn't the cold kind. It was something else. A waiting. a quiet wariness between strangers bound by terms neither of them fully understood. The rooftop gallery was carved out of steel and concrete, softened only by strings of Edison bulbs and the hum of soft jazz drifting through the August air. Sophie stepped onto the terrace beside Julian and felt the collective weight of 100 eyes pivot toward them. She stood straighter, a florist among titans, a borrowed guest in a kingdom of curated wealth. Julian offered her his arm unexpectedly. She hesitated before taking it, her hand light on his wrist, not for balance but for image. The murmurs began immediately. "Who's the girl?" "Not Veronica." "Interesting. She doesn't look like his type." Sophie didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago how to smile with her teeth and keep her soul in her throat. "Stay close," Julian murmured under his breath as they entered the crowd. "I'm not a stray cat," she replied. "Didn't say you were." She could feel the tension in his arm under her touch, controlled, tight, like a man coiled beneath his skin. But he moved through the room with practiced detachment, greeting a senator with a nod, shaking hands with a venture capitalist, avoiding small talk, like it burned. Sophie played her part. She smiled at donors, asked about their art, complimented the skyline view. She was warm where he was distant, curious where he was silent. And though Julian barely spoke, she noticed the way he watched her from the corner of his eye, like he was assessing her under layers she hadn't meant to show. Later, after a calculated tour of the latest installation, an abstract exhibit of oil and resin canvases titled "Grief in Saturation," Sophie excused herself to the bar. The bartender smiled. "Something strong? Something that looks expensive but tastes soft," she said. Like an apology in a glass, he handed her a rose-colored cocktail with a smirk. As she sipped, a woman in emerald heels and too much perfume slid up beside her. "First time?" the woman asked. Sophie glanced sideways. Blonde, early 40s, eyes like coins, cold and counting. "First rooftop?" "No," Sophie said. "First time being silently judged." "Also no." The woman laughed, a sound like crystal fracturing. "I meant first time being." On his arm. Sophie didn't answer. The woman twirled her straw. "You won't last, of course. They never do." Sophie sipped her drink again. "That sounds like a threat wrapped in gossip." "It's not a threat, dear. Just a pattern. Julian Cross collects people, and then he forgets them. I'm not very forgettable. We'll see." She drifted away, leaving behind the scent of lilies gone sour. Sophie found Julian near the edge of the terrace, gazing out at the skyline like it offended him. When she approached, he didn't turn. "Who was that woman?" he asked, without looking. "Someone who thinks you collect people." Julian's jaw tightened. "Mara Langford. Lavier. I funded her gallery. She took it as courtship." "Did you correct her?" "I funded a different one the next season." Sophie let out a dry laugh. "You know, for someone who hates drama, you seem to orbit a lot of it." He turned to her finally, his gaze unreadable. "I orbit what I have to, and tolerate what I can't avoid. You don't strike me as someone who tolerates much." "I don't." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind brushing against her collarbones, lifting stray curls from her shoulder. "You handled yourself well," he said after a pause. "Tonight." High praise from a man who hasn't smiled since the contract was signed. His lips moved just barely. "I don't smile for performance," he said. "Only for honesty." "Then maybe you should try being honest with yourself." His expression changed, not anger, not surprise. Something heavier, like a shutter closing over glass. "Careful," he murmured. Sophie tilted her head. "Is that a warning, Mr. Cross?" "It's a truth." "Which you said you respected." "I do. Even when it's ugly." Julian looked at her, really looked like he was seeing the crack beneath the polish, the stubborn glint beneath her practiced calm. And for a moment, the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was intimate. Then a photographer stepped into view, snapping pictures, and the spell broke. Julian turned away. "We're done for the night. Let's go." The car ride home was quiet again, but not distant. The air between them buzzed, full of things unsaid. Sophie leaned her head against the window, watching the lights blur into rivered streams. "Why 30 days?" she asked softly. Julian didn't answer at first. Then, "Because that's how long people can pretend without breaking." She turned to him, heart twisting. "And after that?" His gaze stayed on the city. "After that, they show who they really are." She watched him in profile, his jaw, his silence, the careful way he breathed, and whispered, "Maybe that's the point." Chapter 4. Shadows and Music. The Cross penthouse was built to be untouchable, 48 stories above the pulse of Manhattan. It wrapped around the skyline in glass and bone-colored stone. The interior was a study in restraint modernist furniture, sharp angles, and clean white walls that somehow made even sound tread softly. Sophie stood just inside the threshold, one foot in the sanctuary of the elevator, the other in his world. Julian had disappeared down the hall with a clipped, "Make yourself comfortable," but comfort was the last thing this place invited. The space felt curated, not lived in frames, like a photograph of a home, not a home itself. She wandered into the living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a dark ocean of city lights. The skyline looked alive like stars had melted and dripped into towers of steel and glass. Sophie moved slowly, her heels echoing against the stone floor, and ran her fingers over the spines of perfectly aligned books on the shelf. Economics, strategy, art theory. No music. No poetry. No fiction. Of course not. Then, a hallway. Narrow, shadowed, somehow colder. She followed it as if drawn, pausing when she came to a door that didn't match the others. It was old wooden, weathered, framed by rich mahogany molding that looked far older than the rest of the minimalist interior. Her fingers hovered near the handle. She shouldn't. She did. The hinges whispered as the door opened, revealing a room soaked in silence. This was no sterile showcase. This was memory. The walls were painted a deep, moody gray. Velvet drapes hung heavy over a single window, drawn closed. A grand piano rested in the center like a beast in slumber, its black lacquer gleaming in the low amber light. Framed photos sat dusted on the upright, though she couldn't see them clearly yet. Sheet music was stacked neatly beside a silver metronome. Still, a cello rested against the far wall, strings silent, bow tucked into a case with reverence. And beside the piano, standing like an unsent letter, a violin. She froze. It wasn't the same model she once held in her youth, but it carried the same quiet sadness. The delicate curve of the body, the hand-carved scroll, the bridge slightly worn from years of pressure and release. This room breathed in ways the rest of the penthouse did not. This room had soul. Sophie stepped inside. The air changed heavier, but not stifling. Like memory had a scent, and it clung to her now. She approached the piano and touched one of the keys. It gave a low, warm note, startling her. Not out of fear, but recognition. It had been years, yet her body remembered. She played another, then another. And then she sat down. Her fingers moved slowly, unsure at first. Just the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Broken. Hesitant. But then, something shifted, something opened, and the music bloomed. Each note spilled into the silence like ink in water. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the weight she carried, the shame, the debt, the broken promise to her younger self lifted. Just a little. Just enough. So when she reached the final chord, and silence fell again, she didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway. Not until he spoke. You knew exactly where to find it. Her breath caught. She turned slowly. Julian stood at the threshold, shadows clinging to his frame like regret. He wore no jacket now, just a charcoal shirt rolled to the elbows, his collarbone visible at the base of his throat. His face was unreadable, but his voice was low. Touched. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. He stepped inside. "You weren't intruding." I followed the music. His lips curved slightly, not in a smile, something sadder. That room hasn't had music in a long time. Sophie stood. It should. It's grieving. Julian looked past her, toward the violin. His expression changed, hardened slightly. It was hers, he said. Elise. He nodded once. She taught at Juilliard. Played here. Ate here. Laughed in that chair by the window. She died 2 years ago. Hit and run in Boston. I never caught the driver. Sophie's throat tightened. She didn't reach for him. Didn't speak. Just let the silence honor the loss. He moved slowly to the piano, trailing his fingers along the keys but not pressing them. His voice was quieter now. She used to play in the mornings. While I read, we didn't need to talk. The music said everything. Sophie exhaled gently. It still does. Their eyes met across the piano bench. And for a moment, the contract between them, the clauses, the appearances, the carefully constructed boundaries, flickered like a film reel, stuttering on the edge of something real. You play beautifully, he said. Not anymore, she replied. You just did. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a breath, play again. Sophie hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keys like they were made of glass. Do you ask all your contract dates to perform? She asked, gently teasing, trying to diffuse the tightness blooming in her chest. Julian didn't smile, but something softened at the corners of his mouth. No. Just the ones who open locked doors without permission and still manage to make the silence feel less cruel. She stared at him, unsure of how to carry the weight of that compliment, or whether it was even a compliment at all. Slowly, she sat again. The bench creaked beneath her as she adjusted her posture, her hands falling naturally into position. Her back straightened, her breath slowed. This time, she chose something different. A piece her mother used to hum while arranging lilies in their shop window. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Gentle, lyrical, melancholy, in a way that didn't hurt, just remembered. The notes fell like rain, delicate and clean, and she let herself go with them. Behind her, Julian stood still as stone. He didn't interrupt. He didn't retreat. He simply watched. When the final chord faded into the silence, Sophie remained still, her hands resting lightly on the keys as though afraid to disturb the air they'd stirred. She felt the space between them change again, becoming something intimate and raw, less a contract, and more a confession. She looked up at him. Julian's face was unreadable, but his eyes, those wintry, ever-guarded eyes, looked bruised, vulnerable, alive. Why did you stop? He asked, voice low. She answered without hesitation. Because I broke something I couldn't fix. Julian tilted his head slightly, waiting. I was at Juilliard, she admitted. Full scholarship. Prodigy track. I pushed too hard. Burned out. Started missing rehearsals. Then I got involved with a guest conductor older. Powerful. He used me, then accused me of cheating when I ended it. Said I stole work. I walked away before the scandal exploded. She shrugged, hollow. Sold my violin. Started over. Julian's expression didn't shift, but the air between them did. He crossed the room slowly, his footsteps deliberate. You didn't break anything, he said. You don't know that. I know you're still playing, he replied. I know you still feel it. She swallowed. Feeling doesn't always fix the past. No, he agreed. But it means you're still brave enough to carry it. The words lingered. Not sweet, not romantic, but true. Julian reached down and lifted the violin from its stand. His fingers moved over it with reverence, as if touching memory. He held it out to her. You'll play this, he said. She stared at the instrument. That's not what I came here to do. You didn't come here at all, he said gently. You were pulled. By debt. Obligation. Desperation. But that doesn't mean you don't belong in this room. She looked at him, then truly looked. At the man known for ice and fortune, standing barefoot on the hardwood, holding out an extension of his grief like an offering. Sophie took the violin. She tucked it under her chin, adjusted the bow, and let out a breath so deep it felt like releasing a decade. Then she played. The melody that spilled from her wasn't rehearsed or perfect, it wavered at the edges, breathy and uncertain, but it was hers. It was alive, and it filled the room like fire in winter. Julian didn't move. His chest rose and fell slower. softer. His eyes closed, and for the first time since Elise's death, he listened to someone else's heartbeat in the shape of a song. After the music faded, Sophie lowered the violin gently, cradling it like a relic. Neither of them spoke. Eventually, Julian cleared his throat and turned away, reaching for a glass of water with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I'll have the music room cleaned tomorrow," he said. "It's time." Sophie placed the violin back in its stand with quiet care. "It doesn't need to be cleaned. Just opened." He nodded once but said nothing. As she moved to leave, she paused at the door. "I didn't mean to find this room," she said. "But I'm glad I did." Julian looked at her, shadows threading through the silver of his eyes. "So am I." That night, Sophie lay awake in the guest suite, an absurdly luxurious space of marble and linen, too silent for dreams. She stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, and whispered into the darkness. "What are you becoming, Sophie Lane? And what was Julian becoming in return?" Chapter 5. The Dance Beneath the Stars. The invitation had been delivered by hand, ivory cardstock, gold ink, a seal of embossed calla lilies. It smelled faintly of bergamot and power. The Whitmore Foundation Rooftop Gala. An evening of art, stars, and legacy. Dress code, formal black tie. No exceptions. Sophie stood in front of the full-length mirror in Julian's penthouse guest suite, slipping the final pearl pin into her hair. The gown Margot had sourced for her, a midnight blue column of silk, clung to her like a second skin. The neckline skimmed her collarbones. The slit at the side was just enough to hint at scandal without losing grace. She almost didn't recognize herself. There was something unnerving about the transformation, how easily her edges could be softened into elegance, her past blurred beneath mascara and a gown with a 5-figure price tag, but she knew better than to mistake polish for protection. Still, when Julian appeared in the hallway, tailored black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, cufflinks that caught the low light like small declarations, her breath stalled. He looked like a secret carved from stone and silence. "You're early," she said, smoothing invisible wrinkles on her dress. His gaze swept over her, not greedy, but precise. "You look luminous." Sophie blinked. That almost sounded like a compliment. It was. A beat. Then, softer. "You'll steal this city tonight." She didn't answer, didn't trust herself to. Instead, she slipped her arm through his and let herself be led to the waiting car, pretending that her heartbeat wasn't writing sonnets against her ribs. The rooftop gala overlooked the Hudson, wrapped in string lights and silk canopies that fluttered like whispered secrets. Waiters moved like choreography between marble statues and golden candlelight. The guests glittered New York's elite in gowns, sharp enough to wound. As they stepped onto the terrace, Sophie felt the temperature of the room shift. Eyes found Julian first. Of course they did. His presence always pulled gravity toward him. But then those same eyes slid to her. The murmurs began. Not cruel. Not loud. Just curious enough to make her spine straighten. Julian leaned toward her as they moved through the crowd. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to." She smirked. "What makes you think I don't want to talk? You've gone quiet. I'm pacing myself. You should try it." He gave her a sideways glance, dry, amused. And something about that made her ache. Later, as the orchestra swelled into a gentle waltz beneath the stars, couples began to gather near the garden circle. Marble statues of muses watched from the hedges. Stars blinked overhead. Sophie lingered at the edge, glass of champagne half empty, wondering if she should pretend not to want the moment that hovered just beyond her reach. Then Julian appeared beside her. "I don't dance," he said. She looked up at him. "Did I ask?" "No," he said. "But I can see it in your face." She laughed, dry. "I'm that easy to read?" "Only when you're trying not to be." A pause. Then, without a word, he took her glass and set it aside. His hand extended steady, open. "Will you show me?" Sophie stared at it. "Now?" "I make no promises. I just want to try." And God help her. She took it. They stepped into the soft circle of candlelight like they were stepping off a ledge. Julian moved slowly, deliberately, as though every motion cost him something. Sophie led it first, then let him adjust. Let him find his rhythm. He was stiffer than he let on, but not graceless. His hand rested lightly against her lower back. His palm held hers like she was something breakable he didn't quite trust himself to hold. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The city blinked around them, but the night belonged to the slow orbit of their bodies. Sophie's heart tripped over itself. Julian's breath was shallow, his jaw tight, but his eyes, God, his eyes were softer than she'd ever seen them. Like the ice had cracked just enough to let the water underneath breathe. She leaned closer. So did they. Their faces hovered, breath mingling in the space between restraint and surrender. And then, he kissed her. Soft. Hesitant. Like a man afraid, he'd forget how. But just as her lips parted and her hand rose to his chest, he pulled away. Too fast. Too far. His face shuddered, like a slammed door. I shouldn't have, he began, voice rough. It's fine, Sophie said quickly, stepping back, a flush creeping up her neck. Forget it. But it wasn't fine. And she wouldn't forget. Because something in her chest had opened something old and foolish and wanting, and he had kissed her like he wanted it too. Sophie didn't speak during the ride back to the penthouse. Neither did Julian. The silence between them was not empty. It was swollen, dense with unspoken questions, half-formed regrets, and the electric aftermath of a kiss that tasted too much like almost. Julian sat stiffly beside her, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, staring out the window as if the skyline could absolve him of something. He looked like a man who had walked into a memory and come out bruised. When they stepped out of the car, Sophie didn't wait for him. She moved through the lobby alone, her heels echoing like defiance across the marble. It wasn't until the elevator doors closed that Julian finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. She didn't turn. For what? The kiss. She exhaled slowly. That's not what you're apologizing for. Julian didn't respond. The elevator hummed upward. Sophie studied their reflections in the mirrored walls, two elegantly dressed strangers standing inches apart and miles away. She didn't know whether to scream at him or kiss him again just to prove he could feel something without breaking. I know you're not ready, she said quietly. His voice was low. It wasn't about readiness. Then what? Julian hesitated. It's been a long time since I touched someone without mourning someone else in the same breath. Sophie finally turned to face him. You think grief has to come at the cost of desire, that if you want something again, it dishonors what you lost. He didn't answer. She stepped closer, close enough to see the shadows beneath his eyes. You kissed me like you wanted to remember, then pulled away like you were terrified it might make you forget. His throat worked. It's not that simple. No, she said, softer now. But it doesn't have to be that cruel, either. The elevator doors opened. Julian didn't follow her into the hallway right away. He stayed behind, one hand pressed to the mirrored wall like it might hold him up. When he finally emerged, Sophie had already gone into the guest suite, closing the door with the gentleness of someone too tired to slam it. Julian didn't sleep. He stood at the glass wall of his bedroom long after the lights of the city dimmed, shirt unbuttoned, sleeves rolled. Manhattan sprawled beneath him, unfeeling, glittering, eternal. But all he could see was Sophie's face as she looked up at him beneath those rooftop lights. Not angry, not even hurt, just real. And he hated how much that mattered. He poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. His mind went to Elise. How she used to dance barefoot in that same room. How she'd hummed Debussy under her breath while folding laundry. How she'd whispered, "Promise me you won't disappear when I'm gone." The night before her last tour, he had disappeared anyway. Until Sophie. He could still feel the warmth of her mouth, the tremble of her breath, the absence of judgment in her eyes. God, what if she wasn't temporary? What if she was real? And what would he do then? The next morning, Sophie stood in the penthouse kitchen barefoot, wearing a borrowed oversized linen shirt and brewing coffee like it was armor. She hadn't meant to stay the night, but she hadn't meant to feel anything either. Julian entered the kitchen without a word, his usual pristine composure slightly frayed, no tie, no jacket, hair still damp from a shower. He looked younger like this, almost reachable. Sophie offered him a second mug without speaking. He accepted it, They sipped in silence. The kind that felt more like a drawbridge than a wall. Uncertain, but not impassable. Julian finally spoke. I'm going to ruin this if I don't get out of my own way. Sophie blinked, startled. That's honest, she said. I don't want to ruin it. She studied him for a long moment. Then stop treating every feeling like it's a grenade in your hands. He set the mug down carefully. You scare me. Sophie's lips quirked. Good. He looked up. Because I scare me too, she added. Julian stepped closer, the air between them growing tighter again. But this time he didn't reach for her. He didn't kiss her. He simply said, I want to try. But you need to know. There's a part of me that still belongs to the past. A part that may never leave the music room. Sophie nodded. I don't want you to leave it. That surprised him. I want to sit there with you, she said. Not as a replacement. Just as someone who hears the silence too. Julian's breath caught. For a moment, neither moved. Then, like a thread being knotted in the space between them, he nodded. I can try that. And it wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a promise. But it was hope. And for Sophie, that was enough to stay. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Rose. The invitation was glossy, blood red, and smelled faintly of Chanel No. Symph, Veronica's signature. The Cross Family Estate Private Garden, Luncheon. To honor legacy. To protect the future. Sophie turned it over in her hands, the paper thick enough to signal elegance and intent. The handwriting on the inner card was perfumed and precise. Julian's presence is expected, and yours. Welcomed. Veronica Dale. Welcomed. The word pulsed with warning. Julian had said little when it arrived. Only that it was strategic for her to be seen, especially after the rooftop gala had sparked whispers about his re-emergence into society. Headlines were soft but persistent. The Ice King melts? Mystery Woman. Accompanies Julian Cross to Whitmore Gala. Who is Sophie Lane, and why now? So Sophie wore a cream. Silk again, but this time softer, with sleeves like petals and buttons that reminded her of antique pianos. She wore her hair half up, simple and unassuming. Let them underestimate her. The Cross estate was tucked behind stone gates in upstate New York, an architectural relic cloaked in ivy and curated nostalgia. She and Julian arrived just after noon. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the town car, like bones being ground down. Julian had said nothing the entire ride. You okay? She asked as the house loomed into view. He nodded, but the nod was shallow. This house wasn't made for kindness. That was all he said. The garden luncheon sprawled beneath manicured trees and gauzy parasols, with crystal glasses sweating in the late summer heat. It was the kind of setting meant to look effortless and expensive, which meant it reeked of preparation and control. Sophie stepped out beside Julian and felt the air shift like glass about to crack. Every face turned. Veronica stood at the far end of the garden, wearing ivory with a splash of crimson silk at her hip. Like a rose, beautiful, deliberate, and laced with thorns. Sophie, she drawled as they approached. You're even lovelier than your photographs. Sophie offered a smile. And you must be Veronica. Julian stiffened beside her. Veronica tilted her head. How charming. I do so love a woman with a spine. Then you'll adore me. Julian made a low sound, something like a cough smothering a laugh. Sophie didn't look at him. Veronica turned her attention to Julian, brushing his cheek with a kiss that landed more like a brand. Darling cousin. You're always full of surprises. He stepped back. We're here to eat, not to perform. Veronica's eyes flashed. Oh, but Julian, don't you know? Those two things are never separate in this family. Lunch was a carefully choreographed affair. Crystal dishes of heirloom tomatoes and smoked salmon, tiny forks for pickled radishes, champagne poured by men who didn't speak. Everyone at the table smiled with polished teeth and spoke in barbed compliments. Sophie said little, watching, learning. Veronica, of course, dominated the table. She spoke of her philanthropic ventures, subtly discrediting competitors. She made passing references to Julian's recent re-entry into society. framing it as if she had orchestrated his return like a conductor behind the curtain. Sophie felt it immediately. The push. The positioning. Veronica didn't want her gone. She wanted her irrelevant, so Sophie waited. And when someone asked her about flowers of all things, she leaned in. "I actually designed the rooftop florals at the Whitmore Gala," she said smoothly. The lilies were Julian's idea. Subtle, romantic, understated. She smiled as she sipped her wine. Julian glanced at her, surprised. He hadn't suggested lilies. But he didn't correct her. Veronica's gaze sharpened. "You must be quite talented," she said, sweet as arsenic. To inspire Julian's input, "He inspires more than he realizes," Sophie replied. Silence fell over the table like a dropped handkerchief. Julian didn't speak, but his thumb brushed the side of Sophie's hand beneath the table barely a touch. Not enough for the others to see, just enough to say, "I see you." And Sophie, for a moment, felt like she might survive this. Und dessert. It came in the form of a quiet, expensive-looking envelope handed discreetly to Veronica by her assistant. Veronica opened it. "Read it," smiled. Then, casually, almost lazily, she slid it down the table toward Julian. He picked it up. His expression changed. Sophie watched the color drain from his face, the careful stillness overtaking his shoulders. Then he turned to Sophie, his voice low and sharp. "Why is there a deposit from Weston Bancorp in your name?" "On the 12th of July. Sophie blinked. "What?" Veronica was already dabbing her lips with a napkin. "Oh dear. Did I ruin the soufflé?" Sophie stared at the paper Julian was now holding. Transfer record. To Lane, Sophie. From Weston Bancorp, Private Fund, Cross Holdings Discretionary. Amount, $75,000. She felt sick. "I never saw this," she said. "It's your name," Julian replied, flat. "I never received that money." Julian, I wouldn't." Veronica gave a soft, wounded sigh. "It's so easy to fall for charm. Especially when you're fragile." Julian stood abruptly. "Sophie," he said, voice like a blade, "we'll talk in the car." But the damage had already been done. And as Sophie stood, eyes burning, throat thick, Veronica lifted her champagne and whispered, "Cheers to revelations." The car ride back to Manhattan felt like purgatory. Julian sat rigid against the door, his face carved from silence. Sophie's heart pounded like a trapped bird in her chest, but she said nothing, not yet. The evidence Veronica had shown him clung to the air between them, thick and poisonous. When they finally stepped into the elevator at the penthouse, Sophie turned to him. "I didn't take that money." Julian's eyes didn't move from the descending numbers above the doors. "It's your name." "That's not proof." "It's not nothing," he said, quiet, measured, wounded. Sophie stepped in front of him, refusing to let the doors open on another unspoken fracture. "You think I've been playing you? For what flowers and champagne? What about my father's hospital bills? My shop? You've seen my life, Julian. If I had $75,000, I wouldn't still be drowning." He didn't respond. His silence hurt more than if he had accused her outright. "I thought," she began, but her voice cracked. Julian closed his eyes. When the doors opened, she didn't follow him. He was waiting in the living room an hour later, glass of scotch untouched on the table beside him. He hadn't changed out of his suit. The tie was gone, the top button undone, but otherwise, he was still in his fortress of armor. "I checked the transaction logs," he said when she entered, arms folded tight across her ribs. "And? It's real. The fund is one I control, but I didn't authorize that transfer." Sophie blinked. Julian looked up, his voice grating like gravel. "But that doesn't prove you didn't. You think I forged a transaction? Into my name? From your holding company?" "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone in my life who has gotten close has wanted something from me, except one person, and she's gone." Sophie felt that, the ghost of Elise still haunting every piano key, every breath between them. "Then maybe you're more afraid of being wanted than being used," she said. He stood. "You don't know anything about what I'm afraid of." "No," she said, stepping back. "Because you won't let me." She moved toward the door of the guest suite. Julian's voice followed her. I want to believe you." Sophie turned. "But you don't." His mouth opened, but no words came. She nodded once. "Then maybe I should go." And this time, he didn't stop her. Outside, the sky had cracked open in rain. She didn't wait for the driver. She walked until her heels blistered, until her dress clung to her skin and her makeup had dissolved into something more honest. She took the subway. No one recognized her now. She wasn't the woman in silk at the billionaire's side. She was just a girl from Brooklyn, soaked and angry and breaking all over again. When she got home, she threw the cream dress into the hamper and curled up on the floor of her father's old room, the oxygen tank still humming beside his bed. He'd once told her love was like music, you couldn't fake timing. She finally understood what he meant. Back in the penthouse, Julian stared at the contract on the kitchen island. Sophie's signature stared back at him. Ink that had once marked agreement now looked like betrayal. But something kept gnawing at him. The numbers didn't add up. The fund wasn't even tied to her contract. The date, the 12th of July, was days before she even agreed to the auction. And something else. Veronica had said the record was handed to her during lunch. But no courier would bring sensitive financial documents to an outdoor event without digital backing. He stood up, walked to his desk, and pulled up the internal audit logs. 10 minutes later, his hand gripped the edge of the desk so tightly the wood creaked. There it was. Veronica's personal login. Used to authorize a private wire transfer from his discretionary fund. He called his head of security. "I want a full forensic trace on all internal activity under Veronica Dale's credentials for the last 60 days, he said. "And I want it yesterday." The man hesitated. "Sir, if she's using her board privileges, she's not going to have them for much longer." Julian hung up, and for the first time in years, he felt something sharp and clear rise in his chest. Rage. Yes. But beneath it, deeper, regret. He had let fear guide him. And he might have already lost the one woman who had never asked for anything but the truth. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Past. Sophie didn't return to the penthouse. Not the next day. Not the one after. Instead, she returned to the only place that still felt like hers. The flower shop on Montague Street. The familiar scent of jasmine and cedar welcomed her like an old friend. She spent the morning trimming roses, rearranging terrariums, and answering delivery calls with a practiced smile that cracked at the edges. It was easier to be busy than to think, but thinking came anyway. The $75,000 transfer, the silence in Julian's eyes, the way he hadn't followed her, hadn't demanded proof, hadn't believed in the girl he'd once watched play Chopin in the dark. That, somehow, had hurt more than the accusation. She was rinsing buckets in the back sink when her phone buzzed. "Margot, you need to see this." Below the text was a link to a gossip blog she usually ignored. But this time, the headline stopped her cold. Sophie Lane, gold, digger, or scapegoat. Veronica Dale under investigation for falsified financial records linked to Cross Holdings. Sophie read the article twice, her breath catching on every word. It was messy, speculative, light on facts, but it mentioned an anonymous whistleblower and access log anomalies, and that Julian Cross had suspended his cousin from all Cross Holdings board duties pending internal review. A slow thrum began beneath Sophie's skin. He knew. He had found out, but he still hadn't called. That evening, she opened the back cabinet and pulled out the violin. Not hers, of course. Her original was still sitting in a pawn shop window somewhere near the Lower East Side. But this one, a rental Margot had insisted on when Sophie agreed to record a few pieces for an independent artist would do. She sat by the window of her tiny Brooklyn apartment, feet curled under her, the city murmuring outside like a distant wave. And she played. Not for performance, not for elegance, but for clarity. The notes came raw and trembling at first, then fuller, steadier. She didn't choose anything well-known. She made it up as she went, fragments, echoes, memories shaped in sound. Pain and longing and grief all lived inside her bow. And still, through it all, Julian's face lingered at the edge of her thoughts, etched in candlelight, shadowed in regret. Unbeknownst to her, across the city, that same music filled the penthouse. Julian sat in the darkened music room, headphones in, body still. He'd found the file on an independent audio site, Sophie's profile, quiet and anonymous, listed only as Bloom Variations. But the moment he pressed play, he knew it was her. The first note had torn him open. He sat there, unmoving, for 10 full minutes after the last sound faded, as if breathing too loudly might erase what he'd just felt. Then he rose, and moved with a clarity he hadn't known since Elise died. The next morning, Sophie opened the shop early, only to find a letter waiting at the door, hand-delivered, sealed in gray parchment. No name on the envelope, just a wax insignia she recognized from Julian's estate. She opened it with cautious fingers. "Miss Lane, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you belief. I let fear speak louder than truth, and I failed you. There is something I want to show you. Not for redemption, but for memory. Come to the Cross Foundation building at 7 p.m. You don't owe me anything, but I hope you come. Julian." She folded the letter and held it to her chest, closing her eyes. There were still petals left to bloom from this story. She just wasn't sure if she was ready to open again. The Cross Foundation building stood like a monolith of glass and intention, nestled among the quieter blocks of the Upper East Side. Sophie had walked past it before, never knowing it belonged to Julian. She'd always thought it looked like a modern museum, silent, expensive, untouchable. But tonight, it was open. And waiting. The lobby was lit only by wall sconces and recessed spotlights, casting long shadows across slate floors. A security guard nodded wordlessly as she entered, gesturing toward the elevator. No questions. No clipboard. Just a knowing glance, like her arrival had been inevitable. The elevator opened on the top floor. And there he was. Julian stood near the far window, framed by the dusk-purple skyline. He wore no suit jacket, just a dark shirt rolled at the sleeves and trousers that looked slept in. The formality was gone, but the gravity remained. He turned as she stepped inside, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," she replied. Julian stepped forward, slowly, like a man approaching the edge of a cliff. "I was wrong," he said. "I should have known the second I saw the date on the wire. You hadn't even met me then. You couldn't have orchestrated that. You wanted to believe I had—" He winced. "Because if you were using me, then I'd be right to keep everyone at arm's length. Safer that way." "Safer doesn't mean better," she said. "Sometimes safety is just another name for fear." Julian nodded. Once, then he moved to the far end of the room and turned on a light. Behind him, a wall rolled back a hidden panel, revealing what looked like a rehearsal space. Wood floors, music stands, a row of chairs, a black lacquer piano gleaming under soft gold light, a few violins displayed in glass cases, each one exquisite. The entire space was beautiful, minimalist, reverent. "I bought this building to house a music program," he said quietly. "Elise wanted to start one for underserved students in the city. We never got the chance." Sophie stepped forward, breath-catching. "I almost sold it after she died," Julian continued. "But something made me hold on. Maybe guilt. Maybe cowardice. Maybe hope." He gestured toward the far wall, where a plaque gleamed. She stepped closer. "The Lane Center for Music and Healing. In honor of those who find their way back to sound." Sophie turned, heart hammering. "You?" He nodded. "It will open next spring. Fully funded. Scholarships. Mentorships. Guest artists. I want it to be something lasting. And I want it to carry your name." Her voice broke. "Julian, why?" He walked toward her. "Because you reminded me that silence isn't the same as peace. That grief isn't a wall, it's a hallway. And maybe we can walk out of it. Together." Sophie's hands trembled. She looked around the room, the instruments, the warmth, the possibility. A place where music could become memory and future at the same time. "You did all this." "I started it for her," he said softly. "But I finished it because of you." Her eyes filled. Julian stepped closer. "I don't expect forgiveness." Sophie met his gaze. "It's not about forgiveness." He swallowed. "Then what is it about?" She hesitated, then placed her hand against his chest right over his heart. It's about trust. He covered her hand with his own. I want to earn that. Then start by dancing with me. He blinked. Here? She smiled, tears glinting. We never finished the rooftop waltz. Julian took her hand. No music played, but they danced anyway. Slow, quiet, close. Just the rustle of silk and the steady beat of two people learning how to hold each other without falling apart. And as the city burned gold outside the windows, Sophie closed her eyes and leaned into the rhythm of something new. Not perfect. Not finished. But true. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Julian Cross didn't make public appearances lightly. Not since Elie's death. Not since he'd chosen retreat over spectacle, silence over scrutiny. But that morning, as his driver pulled up in front of the grand entrance to the Whitmore Conservatory, he stepped out of the car with Sophie at his side, and purpose in every line of his frame. E wore charcoal sleek, minimal, unadorned. She wore navy-tailored, elegant, unflinching, and the cameras were waiting. It had started the night before, after Julian's legal team concluded their internal investigation. The findings had confirmed what he already knew. Veronica had accessed his discretionary fund, used an auxiliary account to launder the transfer, and orchestrated the forged paperwork with the help of a private compliance officer now under federal review. Julian had filed an injunction before midnight. This morning's press conference wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. He squeezed Sophie's hand as they entered the conservatory's atrium, the glass ceiling pouring light down on marble floors and a small stage flanked by rows of folding chairs. Staff members and reporters alike hushed at their arrival. Julian led her to the edge of the platform, then released her hand with a breath. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. His eyes, storm gray and unwavering, met hers. "I'm not sure I've ever been ready for anything. But I am done being afraid." And with that, he stepped up to the podium. Flashes clicked. Cameras whirred. Julian waited for silence, then spoke calm, crisp, and devastating. "Thank you for joining me. I have called this press conference to publicly address recent events that have cast a shadow not only over my name, but over the character of someone I care for deeply." He paused. The silence held. A financial transaction, made without my knowledge, was used to discredit Miss Sophie Lane. That transaction was orchestrated by someone close to me, someone who abused their access and my trust. Julian looked directly at the camera now. There is no polite way to say this. Veronica Dale falsified records in an attempt to isolate and discredit Sophie. That effort has failed. I am terminating Veronica's position on the Cross Holdings board effective immediately, and I have filed formal charges. A stir swept through the room like a breeze through dry leaves. But Julian wasn't finished. This event is not only about justice, it's about accountability. For years, I let grief and fear dictate the walls I built. I mistook distance for safety. And in doing so, I hurt someone who never once asked for anything but honesty. He looked toward Sophie now. She didn't blink. Sophie Lane is not a gold digger. She is not a social climber. She is not a tabloid story. She is a musician, a daughter, a fighter, and I owe her more than this podium can contain. Cameras flashed faster now. Murmurs spread. But Sophie didn't care. Because in that moment, as Julian stood under the dome of glass and sunlight and told the truth in front of the world, he wasn't just defending her. He was choosing her. Openly. Without armor. Afterward, the crowd dispersed like smoke. Julian found Sophie in the wings of the atrium, away from the press, her back to a sculpture of an angel in flight. "I meant all of it," he said, voice quiet now. "Every word. I know. I don't want this to be the end of a contract," he added, stepping closer. "I want it to be the beginning of something real." Sophie looked up at him, searching his face. "You just burned down your legacy for me," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm building a new one. With you." She touched his cheek, thumb brushing the faint stubble along his jaw. "And what if I say I'm not ready?" He leaned in, forehead almost touching hers. "Then I'll wait. I'm not bidding on you this time. I'm standing beside you." Her eyes filled. Not with uncertainty, but with the overwhelming sense that after all the ruin, all the silence, all the false starts, she had finally been seen. They left the conservatory through a side exit, away from the media frenzy. Julian had arranged for the car to be discreet, no entourage, no spotlight. Just the two of them and the echo of something raw, unfinished, and profoundly human still vibrating between them. As they slid into the back seat, Sophie finally exhaled. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian turned to her. "Yes, I did. For me? For us." He didn't reach for her. He didn't try to hold her hand. He simply sat there, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to let her breathe. Sophie watched the streets of Manhattan pass in soft blur. "When you said I reminded you that grief isn't a wall but a hallway, what did you mean?" Julian's jaw flexed. "After Elise died, I built my life around staying still. Around surviving. It felt safer to sit in the dark than to try and walk through it. And now? Now I know the hallway doesn't end unless you move. Unless you risk the light." She didn't answer for a long time. Then, "And you think I'm light? I think you're brave enough to open a door no one else has touched." Sophie turned to him, tears unshed, but not falling. "I'm still afraid." "So am I." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, not a ring box. Thinner. Longer. He opened it to reveal a key. Not gold. Not decorative. Just simple. Real. "This is for the music room," he said. "I had a copy made. It's not a contract. It's not a promise. Just a door that will always be open if you want to walk through it." She took the key slowly, her fingers brushing his. It was heavier than she expected, and somehow more intimate than a proposal. "Julian, I'm not asking you to stay," he said, "but I'm asking you not to run." Sophie closed the box and held it to her chest, then leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against his. "I'm tired of running," she whispered, "but I won't be your redemption project." "You're not," he said. "You're the one who reminded me redemption is possible." Their lips were just inches apart, breath mingling, the world narrowing again to the fragile intimacy that had always lived between them. But this time, neither of them pulled away. The kiss was quiet. No rooftop. No violin. No crowd. Just two broken people choosing softness over fear. The next day, Veronica's departure dominated headlines. Cross-dynasty shake-up, Veronica Dale removed from board. Sophie Lane cleared in financial misconduct case. Julian Cross calls for a more human legacy and press statement. Sophie didn't read the articles. She spent the morning arranging white roses and lisianthus in her shop, the petals cool under her fingers, her heart strangely light. When the news broke, clients sent apologies, flowers, and a few quiet invitations to collaborate. She ignored most of them, except one. A handwritten card slid through the shop mail slot, embossed with the crest of the Whitmore Youth Conservatory. "We'd be honored to have you speak to our students about finding music again after loss. We've read your story. They need to hear your voice." She stared at the message for a long time, then opened her laptop and wrote back, "Yes," with a violin. That night, Julian sent her a message. No pressure. Just 5 words. "The Bloom Room misses you." She didn't reply, but she unlocked the music room door before midnight. Chapter 9. The Music Center. It was raining the day of the unveiling. Not a downpour, not a storm, just that steady, silver kind of rain that softened edges and made the world feel slower, more deliberate. Sophie stood beneath a black umbrella on the steps of the Lane Center for Music and Healing, watching guests stream into the glass lobby, their coats damp and their voices hushed with reverence. Inside, everything shimmered. Strings of soft lights glowed like constellations above the main atrium, where a curved grand piano sat beneath a sculpture of cascading metal leaves. Students in Navy uniforms held string instruments in trembling hands, tuning under the guidance of volunteers and teachers Sophie had helped interview just weeks before. It felt surreal. It felt earned. The plaque at the entrance still made her heart stutter every time she passed it. The Lane Center for Music and Healing, in honor of those who find their way back to sound. She hadn't chosen the inscription, Julian Hut. And somehow, he had known exactly what to say. She felt him before she saw him. He approached quietly, umbrella tilted just slightly toward her to shield her shoulder from the wind. No suit today, just a dark wool coat, a navy scarf, and an expression full of careful hope. "You came," he said softly. "I helped design the curriculum," she said, lips curving. It felt rude to ghost opening day. He smiled at that, his first real smile in days, unguarded, warm, a little stunned. "It's beautiful," she added. "You built something that matters." "So did you." Julian turned, facing the building as though seeing it for the first time. "There were moments I thought it would never happen. I came close to selling the lot 3 times. Once, to an investment group that wanted to turn it into luxury apartments." She looked at him, brow raised. "You would have bulldozed a future just to forget the past." He nodded. "I was good at erasing things back then. And now? Now I want to remember what made me stay." Their eyes met. He didn't move closer. But he didn't have to. Inside, the ceremony began with a cello duet and a brief welcome speech from the city's cultural affairs director. Sophie sat in the front row, heart fluttering like it had borrowed its rhythm from an overture. Julian sat beside her, hands folded loosely, eyes tracking every note, every movement. Then the MC took the podium. "And now," she said, "we invite the inspiration for this center, Miss Sophie Lane, to the stage." Applause rippled like a tide. Sophie's stomach flipped. She hadn't been told she'd be speaking. This hadn't been planned. But when Julian stood and offered his hand to help her up, she knew it was always meant to happen. She took a breath, then took the stage. "I used to think music was something that left you when life got too loud," she began, voice steady despite the microphone amplifying her every breath. "When I walked away from it, I told myself I'd never go back, that it had betrayed me, or I had betrayed it, or both." A hush fell over the room, but then something changed. Someone reminded me that music doesn't disappear. It waits. Quietly, patiently, like memory, like love. Her eyes found Julian's. He was watching her not like a man proud of what he'd created, but like someone in awe of what she had reclaimed. "This center isn't about talent or performance," Sophie continued. "It's about healing. About finding the courage to hear yourself again after silence, after heartbreak, after everything you thought you lost." She paused, let it land. "Thank you for giving me a place to hear myself again." The applause this time was louder, brighter, real. Sophie stepped down from the stage, pulse racing, cheeks flushed. Julian was waiting at the bottom. He didn't speak. He just pulled her gently into an embrace warm and steady and completely unguarded. And in the shelter of that applause, Sophie allowed herself the first full exhale of the day. The reception moved into the heart of the Lane Center, its studio classrooms, open rehearsal halls, and a sunlit atrium with high ceilings that caught the music and let it float like silk through the air. Children stood at practice pianos. Teenagers cradled violins with cautious reverence. Parents and donors moved slowly through the rooms, watching the way joy and shyness danced together on young faces. Sophie wandered between the groups, no longer just a name on the plaque or a symbol in Julian's story. She was part of it now, tangible, present. Her hands had shaped the curriculum, chosen the staff, arranged the scholarships. She had given something back to the sound that once abandoned her. Or maybe the sound had simply waited. In a small practice room with glass walls, a boy, maybe 9, maybe 10, sat at a cello, frowning. His bow scraped instead of sang. He cursed under his breath and set the instrument down too hard. Sophie stepped inside without fanfare. "Trouble?" He looked up, defensive. "It's broken." "Let me see." She knelt beside him and picked up the bow. The rosin was dry and clumped. "It's not broken," she said gently. "It's just waiting to be listened to." He scowled. "That doesn't make sense." She smiled. "Music rarely does. But it always matters." She tightened the bow, showed him how to adjust his grip, how to lean his ear toward the body of the instrument, as though listening to a friend instead of fighting an enemy. He played again. Still rough. Still uncertain. But something shifted. He stopped after a few bars, looked at her with something like awe. "Are you famous?" "No," she said, "but I've been lost. And that's better." She left him practicing again, the notes fuller now, his confidence a little louder. Outside the room, Julian waited, leaning against the glass wall. "You were right," he said quietly. "You were never a performance. You were always a presence." Sophie shrugged. "I'm just trying not to run anymore." Julian reached into his pocket, pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. "I wanted to wait," he said, "but this felt right." He unwrapped it and held it out. It was a violin. Not the rental. Not one from the center. Herr Violin, the 19th century Vuillaume. Restored. Polished. Whole. Her breath caught. "I tracked it down," Julian said. "I had my team visit every shop on the Lower East Side until they found it. I wasn't sure you'd want it back." Her hands trembled as she took it. "I pawned it when I thought I'd never deserve to play again. Now it's yours," he said. "No conditions. No contract." Tears welled in her eyes. "This isn't a gift," she whispered. "No," Julian said. "It's a return." She didn't kiss him. Not yet. She was too full, too overwhelmed. But her fingers brushed his, and that touch, simple, steady, was more intimate than any vow. That evening, long after the guests had gone and the rooms had emptied, Julian unlocked the final door on the top floor of the Lane Center. Sophie followed him inside. The room was circular, with windows all around. It overlooked the river. The space was empty except for 2 chairs, a music stand, and a soft wool rug that dulled the echo of their footsteps. Julian sat. Sophie raised the violin to her chin and began to play. Not for them. Not for memory. Not for ghosts. But for the life waiting just beyond the last note. Chapter 10. The Proposal. The garden was private, hidden in the heart of the Lane Center's rooftop, tucked behind walls of ivy and flowering magnolia trees. Wisteria curled around trellises like strands of memory, brushing the shoulders of guests as they moved quietly between candlelit tables and trays of champagne. It wasn't a party. It was something quieter. Something earned. Julian had called it a thank you dinner for donors, staff, and the inaugural class of the center's youth program. But Sophie knew better. This was closure. And maybe if he had the courage beginning. She stood near the entrance in a flowing ivory dress, barefoot on the stone path, violin tucked beneath one arm. Her hair was braided with tiny jasmine blossoms, her skin kissed by the golden light of the city's descending sun. She looked like something out of a dream Julian had long ago told himself he didn't deserve. But tonight, he was done refusing the things that terrified him. He approached slowly, dressed in soft gray, no tie, no armor. "You said I looked luminous once," she said with a smile as he neared. "I was wrong," he said. Her brow lifted. He reached for her hand. "You look like forever." She laughed, soft, disbelieving. "That's not a safe thing to say." "I'm not interested in safe." He turned toward the small platform where a few strings had been warming up. Now they paused, waiting. Julian gestured to the stage. "Will you play with me?" She blinked. "You play?" He held up a guitar. It wasn't new. It was scuffed around the edges, worn at the frets. But it was real. "I used to," he said, "before I stopped listening to anything that sounded like joy." Sophie nodded. "Let's make it sound like something again." They took the stage together. No introduction. No announcement. Just 2 people, 1 violin, 1 guitar, and a moment suspended above a city that always demanded noise but now listened in stillness. Sophie began with a simple melody, pure, steady. Julian followed, his chords soft but deliberate, guiding without overpowering. They weren't perfect, but they were in tune. And when the last note fell away, the garden broke into quiet applause. Julian turned to her, heart hammering. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. Not a ring. Not yet. But a folded piece of sheet music. Sophie took it with puzzled fingers and unfolded the page. There, written in pencil across the top staff line, "For the girl who played the silence back into song." Underneath, scrawled in his neat hand, "Will you write the rest of it with me?" Her eyes met his. I don't want grand, he said. I don't want perfect. She blinked, tears already rising. I want every flawed note, every missed beat. Every morning we forget who we are and remember together. I want to build the quiet with you. And fill it. He reached into his other pocket now, and this time it was a ring. A simply gold band, no diamond. Just an inscription inside. You stayed. Julian went to one knee, not performative, not dramatic. Just present. Real. Will you marry me, Sophie Lane? The wind rustled the wisteria. Sophie stared at him through shimmering eyes. Then said, play the first bar again. He frowned, confused, laughing. What? She raised the violin. Play the first bar. He lifted the guitar, struck the first chord. She played 2 notes in return, gentle, rising. Then she stepped forward and kissed him. The applause faded behind them. The garden hummed again with conversation, soft laughter, clinking glasses. But for Julian and Sophie, the world had narrowed to a single note held between them, a moment suspended like breath just before the next phrase. She hadn't said the word. She hadn't needed to. That kiss, quiet, sure, irrevocable, had been her answer. Julian still held the ring, his hands unsteady for the first time in years. She reached down and took it from him, turning it in her fingers before sliding it onto her own hand. No fanfare? He murmured. Just feeling, she said. His throat worked around the emotion. You terrify me, you know. I'm not a risk, she whispered. I'm a choice. He kissed her again. Slower this time. Certain, as if memorizing her into his bones. Later, after most of the guests had gone and the musicians packed their instruments, Sophie remained in the rooftop garden, now quiet beneath the halo of string lights and the hush of a New York night. Julian had gone downstairs briefly to take a call from the foundation board. She sat on the edge of the platform, barefoot, the hem of her dress brushing her ankles. Her violin rested in her lap, the ring now glinting quietly on her left hand. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a woman who had walked through fire and chosen not to stay burned. Music drifted faintly from a speaker nearby, Debussy, of course. Always him. And then, soft footsteps behind her. I told them I'm stepping down, Julian said as he returned. Sophie looked up. From the board? He nodded, lowering himself beside her. I'll stay involved, but I don't want to be a figurehead anymore. I want to be here. With you. With this place. I want to teach. Mentor. Maybe even, he smiled faintly, start a scholarship in Elisa's name. Sophie squeezed his hand. She'd love that. I think she would too. They sat in silence for a while, watching the lights of the city flicker beyond the garden walls. Then Julian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded photo. He handed it to her without a word. It was Elise standing beside the piano, laughing, holding a sheet of music upside down. There was ink on her nose. Sophie smiled. She looks like she made everything brighter. She did. Until it hurt too much to remember. He looked at her now. But you made it safe to remember again. Sophie placed the photo on the platform, face up, between them. Then let's remember her. Together. A week later, the first class began at the Lane Center. The children arrived with second-hand instruments and nervous energy, eyes wide, hands fidgeting. Julian greeted each of them at the door. Sophie tuned violins and adjusted chairs, her sleeves rolled, her laughter easy. When a young girl dropped her bow and burst into tears, Sophie knelt beside her and whispered, "It's okay. The music's still inside you." And the girl believed her, because she had lived it. They were married in the Bloom Room 2 months later, not in a grand ceremony. No press. No velvet eisle. Just candlelight, a Steinway, and 50 people who understood what it meant to lose and choose to love anyway. Margot cried. Julian's voice cracked as he said, "I do." And Sophie? She played their vows instead of speaking them. 3 minutes of melody. Every note true. In the years that followed, their lives didn't become a fairy tale. There were hard days. Quiet griefs that returned like old ghosts. Board meetings that strained patience. Weathered fingers. Sleepless nights. But there was also music. Laughter in the hallway. Letters from students who said things like, "You made me believe I wasn't broken." And every Sunday morning, before the world woke, Julian would sit at the piano while Sophie stood behind him, arms around his shoulders, her cheek resting against his hair. They didn't speak during those moments. They didn't have to, because they had built a life not out of perfection, but out of possibility. And every single day, they chose it. Again, and again, and again.